Have you ever felt that the deeper aspects of who you are, your thoughts, your insights, your true nature, remain completely invisible to those around you, as if you're speaking a language no one else understands? There's a reason why the most perceptive minds often feel the most isolated. Today, we're exploring why intelligent, self-aware people frequently experience a profound sense of being unseen, a phenomenon Nietzsche called the loneliness of the heights. This invisible burden weighs on millions who wonder, why do I feel so disconnected when I'm trying so hard to connect? The answer might change how you view every relationship in your life. If this resonates with something inside you, that feeling of being the only one who sees what others miss, hit subscribe. This channel explores truths others are afraid to acknowledge. There exists a particular form of loneliness that doesn't come from being physically alone, but from being psychologically unseen. It's the experience of moving through the world with insights, perceptions, and sensitivities that others either cannot recognize or actively dismiss. Friedrich Nietzsche captured this isolation when he wrote, "Whoever climbs high mountains laughs at all tragedies, real or imaginary. From these heights, one sees differently and is seen differently by those below." This sensation of invisibility isn't simply occasional social awkwardness. For the highly perceptive, it becomes a chronic condition, a persistent feeling that one's authentic self remains hidden behind a veil that others cannot or will not penetrate. Arthur Schopenhauer observed that talent hits a target no one else can hit, genius hits a target no one else can see. But what happens when your very existence centers around seeing these invisible targets? What occurs when your natural lens reveals layers of reality that remain opaque to most? Today, we'll explore why intelligent, reflective individuals so often feel misunderstood, examining 6 psychological and philosophical dynamics that create this painful disconnect. More importantly, we'll discover how to navigate this experience without surrendering your depth or damaging your sense of self, because the burden of seeing deeply doesn't have to mean living invisibly. Chapter 1. The cognitive isolation of metacognition. The first reason perceptive people feel unseen stems from what psychologists call metacognition, the ability to think about thinking itself. While most people live primarily in the immediate experience of their lives, those with heightened metacognitive abilities exist simultaneously in 2 worlds, the direct experience and their awareness of that experience. This creates the first layer of invisibility. When you constantly observe your own thought patterns, questioning assumptions that others accept without hesitation, you develop a relationship with reality that differs fundamentally from those around you. You notice the subtle contradictions in conversations, the unspoken social rules that govern interactions, and the unconscious motivations driving behavior. All while others remain focused solely on the surface narrative. Nietzsche recognized this when he wrote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." Your metacognitive flight, your ability to hover above and analyze what others simply live through, creates a perception gap that can rarely be bridged through ordinary conversation. Your questions become too deep, your observations overthinking. What feels like essential clarity to you is experienced as unnecessary complexity by others. This cognitive isolation manifests in daily interactions that leave you feeling strangely disconnected. You might notice the inconsistency between someone's words and behavior, sensing the deeper currents of their unexpressed emotions or motivations. Yet, when you attempt to address these layers, you're met with confusion or dismissal. You're reading too much into things, they say, unaware that your perception isn't a choice, but your natural way of processing reality. Over time, this creates a painful dilemma. Speak your truth and risk being seen as unnecessarily complex, or simplify your perspective and feel invisible. Many intelligent people eventually default to the latter, presenting a reduced version of themselves that others can comfortably recognize, while the depths of their perception remain unseen. Chapter 2. The Envy Barrier and Intellectual Shadow. The second reason for this invisibility paradoxically stems from the very visibility of intelligence. When your perceptiveness becomes apparent to others, it often activates what Schopenhauer identified as a primal human reaction: envy. Talent, he noted, is like a marksman who hits a target others cannot reach. Genius is like a marksman who hits a target others cannot see. But what he didn't explicitly state is how observers respond to witnessing such marksmanship. This response creates what we might call the envy barrier, a psychological defense mechanism where others unconsciously refuse to fully see you because acknowledging your depth would require confronting their own limitations. Carl Jung would recognize this as projection of the intellectual shadow, the disowned aspects of intelligence that people have suppressed within themselves. When you articulate an insight that illuminates something others have missed, it creates cognitive dissonance. Rather than adjusting their understanding, which requires vulnerability, many respond by diminishing the messenger. Your clarity becomes overthinking, your precision pedantry, your depth impracticality. The dismissal serves to protect the observer from the discomfort of recognition. This dynamic appears in virtually every domain. In professional settings, your strategic foresight that could prevent future problems gets labeled as negativity. In personal relationships, your ability to name emotional undercurrents becomes creating drama. In intellectual discussions, your capacity to see multiple perspectives simultaneously is dismissed as complicating simple issues. What makes this particularly painful is its circularity. The more accurately you perceive this dynamic, the more likely you are to experience it. Your awareness of being diminished becomes further evidence of your oversensitivity. The trap seems inescapable. Either you pretend not to notice the envy barrier, thereby falsifying your experience, or you acknowledge it and reinforce the perception that you're difficult. Nietzsche understood this when he wrote, "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster." The monster here isn't intelligence itself, but the isolation it creates, the temptation to become cynical, withdrawn, or contemptuous in response to being consistently misunderstood. Chapter 3. The Linguistic Divide and Conceptual Horizons. The third dimension of this invisibility emerges from language itself, specifically from what philosophers call conceptual horizons. Your ability to perceive nuance depends largely on the conceptual frameworks available to you. When your internal vocabulary far exceeds the shared language of those around you, genuine communication becomes remarkably difficult. Ludwig Wittgenstein famously noted that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. For the highly perceptive person, this creates an asymmetrical situation. You can understand others' simpler conceptual frameworks, but they cannot access your more complex ones. It's like trying to explain color to someone who sees only in monochrome. The necessary reference points simply don't exist. This linguistic divide manifests most painfully in emotional and intellectual territories. You might possess precise language for subtle emotional states that others experience as vague unease or general satisfaction. While they navigate with emotional compasses that point only to good or bad, you perceive the full spectrum between contentment and joy, between melancholy and despair, between interest and passion. Similarly, your thinking likely employs nuanced distinctions, differentiating between types of knowledge, qualities of evidence, or degrees of certainty. When you say, "I think" or "I know," these terms carry specific epistemological weight that becomes flattened in general conversation. Your attempt at precision appears as hair-splitting to those operating with broader categories. This creates what Schopenhauer might recognize as a fundamental loneliness, the impossibility of being fully known by others when the very framework of your understanding remains inaccessible to them. You experience what phenomenologists call the tragedy of communication, the inevitable gap between the richness of lived experience and the poverty of available expression. Over time, this linguistic isolation often leads to a painful adaptation. You begin translating downward, simplifying your insights to fit within accessible frameworks, knowing that something essential is lost in this transaction. Each translation diminishes not just your ideas, but your sense of being recognized. The parts of yourself expressed in this common language might be seen, but the complex architecture of your actual thought remains invisible. Chapter 4. The Depth Perception Penalty. The fourth dimension reveals itself in what we might call the depth perception penalty, the social cost of seeing beneath surface appearances. In a culture increasingly organized around simplified narratives and immediate impressions, the ability to perceive complexity becomes paradoxically disadvantageous. This creates a painful dilemma where your greatest strength becomes the source of your invisibility. When most social and professional environments operate at the level of abstraction that Nietzsche would call the herd perspective, your capacity to perceive multiple layers simultaneously becomes a liability rather than an asset. You notice the contradictions in organizational messaging that others accept without question. You sense the emotional undercurrents in group dynamics that others cannot name. You recognize patterns emerging before they've fully formed. In environments designed for speed rather than depth, this perceptiveness is experienced as friction. Your questions slow down processes designed for quick consensus. Your observations complicate narratives crafted for simplicity. Your awareness of potential problems introduces complexity where others seek clarity. What you experience as necessary thoroughness, others experience as unnecessary complication. Social psychology reveals how this dynamic reinforces itself. Groups naturally move toward homeostasis by either integrating or excluding elements that introduce complexity. When your perceptions consistently challenge the group's preferred level of simplicity, you face subtle but persistent pressure to either conform or withdraw. Many intelligent people eventually discover that their acceptance within communities depends on concealing rather than revealing their depth of perception. This depth perception penalty appears particularly in decision-making contexts. Research shows that groups often reject accurate but complex perspectives in favor of simpler but less accurate ones, especially under conditions of uncertainty. Your ability to hold multiple variables simultaneously to see the full chessboard while others focus on the immediate move becomes a source of isolation rather than influence. Schopenhauer captured this paradox when he observed that the discovery of truth is prevented more effectively, not by the false appearance things present and which mislead into error, not directly by weakness of the reasoning powers, but by preconceived opinion, by prejudice. Your capacity to see beyond these preconceptions doesn't automatically translate into the ability to help others see similarly. What makes this particularly painful is the choice it continually forces. Simplify your perception to maintain connection, or maintain your perception and accept diminished recognition. Either way, something essential about your experience of reality remains unseen. Chapter 5. The Burden of Projection. The fifth reason for this invisibility stems from what depth psychology calls projection, the unconscious process whereby people attribute to you qualities that actually originate within themselves. For the perceptive person, this creates a persistent distortion where others' reactions tell you more about them than about your actual nature. When you possess above-average intelligence or self-awareness, you become what Jung would call a perfect projection carrier, a screen onto which others project their unresolved relationships with intelligence, insight, or depth. If someone was criticized for being too intellectual in their formative years, they may reflexively experience your thoughtfulness as pretension. If another was praised exclusively for practical achievements, they may interpret your conceptual thinking as impractical indulgence. This projection mechanism operates almost entirely outside conscious awareness. The person projecting doesn't recognize that they're responding not to you, but to an internal representation triggered by your qualities. This creates interactions where the actual content of your communication becomes secondary to the psychological material it activates in the listener. Social psychology has documented how persistent these projections become when reinforced by confirmation bias. Once someone has categorized you as the overthinking one or the complex one, they selectively perceive everything you do through this lens. Your straightforward statements are heard as needlessly complex. Your genuine questions are interpreted as intellectual posturing. Your emotional responses are dismissed as overthinking. What makes this dynamic particularly isolating is its resistance to direct address. Attempting to correct projections often strengthens rather than dissolves them, as your very awareness of the dynamic becomes further evidence of your overthinking. The more accurately you perceive the projection process, the more it reinforces the original distortion. This creates what Sartre might recognize as a form of bad faith, a situation where your authentic expression becomes nearly impossible because the medium of communication itself is systematically distorted. Your words and actions are not received as offered, but as filtered through others' unresolved psychological material. For many intelligent people, this burden of projection creates a profound exhaustion. The energy required to continually distinguish between actual feedback and others' projections depletes the very cognitive resources that might otherwise be directed toward genuine connection or creative expression. Chapter 6. The Paradox of Self-Awareness. The final dimension reveals the most painful paradox. Your very awareness of these dynamics further intensifies your experience of invisibility. This creates what we might call the observer's trap. The more clearly you perceive the mechanisms that prevent you from being seen, the more these mechanisms affect your experience. When you recognize the projection, envy, or simplification happening in an interaction, you face an impossible choice. Acknowledge this awareness, thus confirming others' perception of your overthinking, or suppress your perception, thus betraying your own experience. Either way, something essential about your nature remains unexpressed. This recursive loop intensifies the original wound. Your awareness of being unseen becomes yet another layer of perception that cannot be shared, creating what Nietzsche might recognize as a form of existential solitude. The experience of perceiving truths that cannot be communicated without reinforcing the very isolation they describe. The psychological impact of this paradox often manifests as a particular form of loneliness that coexists with connection. You may maintain relationships, engage in communities, and participate in social structures while simultaneously experiencing a persistent sense that these connections touch only the surface of your actual being. The deepest currents of your perception remain untranslated, creating what philosophers call the divided life, the gap between inner experience and outer expression. This paradox appears most painfully in moments of apparent recognition, when someone says, "I understand exactly what you mean," regarding an insight that you know contains layers they haven't acknowledged. You face the choice between accepting this partial recognition or risking the connection by clarifying the depth they've missed. Many intelligent people learn to accept these moments of partial visibility as the closest approximation of being truly seen. What makes this especially difficult is that your awareness of this dynamic doesn't eliminate your human need for recognition. As social creatures, we fundamentally require the experience of being known by others. When this need consistently goes unmet, Due to the complexity of your perception, it creates a particular form of grief, mourning the connections that might have been possible if your full depth could be recognized. The experience of being unseen, despite your depth of perception, represents not a failure, but a fundamental condition of advanced consciousness. Nietzsche understood this when he wrote, "Every deep thinker is more afraid of being understood than of being misunderstood. The fear stems not from arrogance but from recognition, the awareness that true understanding would require others to perceive realities they've spent lifetimes avoiding. This invisibility carries genuine pain, but it also contains unexpected gifts. Your capacity to see what others miss gives you access to dimensions of existence that remain closed to those who have never questioned conventional perception. Your metacognitive awareness allows you to find meaning in complexities that others might never explore. Your linguistic sophistication enables you to articulate internal states that would otherwise remain nameless. The path forward doesn't require choosing between depth and connection. Rather, it involves developing what we might call perceptual flexibility, the ability to move between levels of awareness depending on context. This isn't about dumbing yourself down, but about recognizing when depth serves understanding and when it creates unnecessary distance. It also involves finding those rare individuals who can match your depth of perception, the ones Nietzsche called friends of solitude. These connections may be fewer than conventional relationships, but they offer something far more valuable: the experience of being truly seen. A single conversation where your full complexity is recognized can sustain you through countless interactions where it isn't. Perhaps most importantly, this journey requires developing a relationship with your own depth that doesn't depend on external validation. When your sense of wholeness comes from honoring rather than hiding your perception, the pain of being unseen diminishes. You learn to value your awareness, not despite its isolation, but because of the unique perspective it provides. If this exploration has resonated with you, if you felt that peculiar loneliness that comes from seeing what others don't, know that you're not alone in your aloneness. Leave a comment sharing your experience. Subscribe to walk deeper with us into these territories of mind and meaning. And remember, sometimes the greatest gift of perception isn't being fully seen by others, but fully seeing yourself.